Turn your polygroups into bevel panels with panel loops. Panel loops is located in the Geometry subpalette under Edge Loop tab. These are our settings. You need at least 2 polygroups to use panel loops. Use the slice brush or any other method of polygrouping your mesh. When done, navigate to the panel loops section and press panel loops button to generate panels. Apply smoothing to your mesh and you'll see it's still one solid piece. Enable panel loops double option to turn your polygroups into complete shell panels. Applying smooth will widen the segment, showing that they are now individual shells. Use your selection tool along your panel loops to create all sorts of shapes. Panel loops is a very versatile feature. Use it to create beveled edge segments from single-sided meshes. Disable the double option in order to enable the enter button option for panel loops. ZBrush will perform a sort of inset on each polygroup. Also, try this with your selection tool to generate some interesting results. The append feature is one of my favorite panel loops options. Once enabled, press the panel loops button and ZBrush will generate a new panel shell based off any visible polygroups on screen. Also, be sure to try the append feature using your selection tools. Setting the thickness is usually a trial and error sort of affair. Very small thickness values usually work fine. However, it's easy to overextend the thickness where it's overlapping edges. One way to resolve overlapping edges would be to use the Polish by Features deformation to clean things up. This method will smooth everything. For more accuracy around edges, use the Mask by Features option with only polygroup selected. Invert your mask and now apply Polish by Features to clean up your edges. The polish slider controls the smoothing applied to your mesh in the panel loops process. The effects on your edges can be subtle depending on the poly count of your model. The Ignore Groups button, when enabled, will apply panel loops to your visible geometry, ignoring your polygroups. The Regroup Panels button, when enabled, will regroup the panel portions with the same polygroup. The Regroup Loops button, when enabled, will regroup the loops portion with the same polygroup. The Bevel slider controls the bevel size of your panels. Higher values create overlapping, so use polish deformations to clean up edges. The Elevation slider controls the direction ZBrush expands your thickness of your panels. A value of 100 will produce a very inflated look. A value of 0 will produce less inflation, and a value of -100 will produce no inflation. The Bevel Profile graph controls the shape of your loops. The number of points used needs to roughly correspond with the number of loops used. With a total of 4 points on the graph, I will set the loop slider to a value of 3. Next, I will isolate a portion of the mesh and click Panel Loops with the following settings. Next, I will isolate a portion of the mesh and click Panel Loops with the following settings. Zoomed in, you can see the same profile shape along the edges. Simply click and drag on the curve to place new points and reshape your profile. Though this graph has a total of 8 points, we can get by with one less loop if needed. I will select my loops and set it to 7 and click the panel loops to generate. Once again, when zoomed in, you can see the same bevel profile along the edges of your loops. The Delete Loops button works together with the Angle slider. ZBrush will delete poly loops that are below this set angle value. Ultimately, the higher the value, the more loops that will be deleted. This is helpful for quick poly reduction. On the left is the Delete Loops, and on the right is the Align Loops. Align works similar to Delete Loops in its results. On the left is the partial option for Delete Loops, and on the right is the Groups option for Delete Loops. That wraps up Panel Loops. In the next clip, we will discuss Bevel Pro.